I'd like now to transition to the next session, Africa and the globe and the world. We've been everywhere. Africa and the G20 lessons and forward thinking, reflections on South Africa's G20 presidency. We have a T20 panel by the Institute of Global Dialogue South Africa. I'd like now to invite Sanusha Naidu, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Global Dialogue, to come and take us through the discussion. Please, let's remain and so that we can support them and engage them. Sanusha, I'll hand over to you at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Good afternoon. I know this is the worst panel of the day because it stands between you and going home. But if I may, is there still coffee outside? Is there? So if you want to grab your coffee and come in, we can do that, but we'll continue the discussion. So let me call my panelists down to the floor. Dr. Duma, who's here, and then, of course, Dr. Marina Murusan. And I'm looking for Mr. Kubai, if he's here. Ah, lovely. So there's Mika. So while you're all settling yourselves in, I think what I want to do is, I don't want to make this a presentation style. I want to make it a conversation. Because a conversation would then enable us to try and extract as much as we can. And for those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Sanusha Naidu with the Institute for Global Dialogue. And just a little bit of background about this panel. When Bob came to Dr. Pani Mthembu, our executive director, and myself, he said he wanted to talk about one of the engagement groups in the G20. And the discussion was, how does it fit into the conference theme of amplifying African voices? And so for me, I think the interesting dynamic that we have here today with our three panelists or discussants, or however we want to introduce you, is that they all have been involved in the T20 process. And of course, they all have a kind of inside perspective, which I don't have because I wasn't as involved with like they were, and give you a sense of what discussions happen at the think tank level. And I know it's a bit of a hectic debate to have at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, but I guess we could always take this discussion as a thread into the other panels. So what I want to do is, firstly, I want to introduce the panel. So for those of you who don't know, this is Mika Kubai. He's our colleague at the Institute for Global Dialogue, but you're also with the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation. We've got Dr. Duma, who's a senior researcher at the, well, he's at the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation, but he moonlights for IGD. And then, of course, we have Dr. Marina Murusan, who used to be with the IGD, but now she's basically left us and she's gone to UNISA. You've been deployed. And just to let you know, she's deployed as a postdoctoral fellow in nuclear economics, so whatever that means. So she's probably doing a lot of nuclear stuff with the uranium and things. But before we go on, and I'm standing because, for whatever reason, the one thing I want to ask each of you, and let me start with you, Mika, because your role in the T20, if you can give us a background on what the T20, how it actually forms part of the G20, and what is the kind of engagements that you look at. But it doesn't just happen in a vacuum. You were in Brazil last year at the T20. You were very much involved in the T20 with the South African T20 delegation. So maybe just for those who want to actually go into government, there are some interesting spaces that you may look at. So yeah, let's start with you.
Thank you, Sanusha.
Okay.
The Think 20 is described, by many as an ideas bank of the G20. So it's an engagement group of think tanks, researchers, practitioners, experts in a variety of fields, that concern the G20, or where, the G20 has a direct, sometimes maybe an indirect, a role, to play. So the process is a lengthy one for the T20. The purpose of the Think 20 is to deliver, ideas, is to deliver recommendations, is to deliver proposals, on what is to be done, about, all of the issues, that, a particular presidency, would have set as priority areas, right? So when you start, by setting up, a variety of task forces, to work, on those, areas that, are, in support, essentially, of the presidency at the time. And you then move to the setting up. Excuse me, colleagues, I'm a bit exhausted, so. So we set up task forces. Task forces, you can give any number of researchers and think tanks in a task force, depending on your budget, depending on the sort of scale of the publications in the end that you will want to publish. You then issue out a call to prospective authors of policy briefs that, of course, with parameters, on the thematic areas, the length, all of those, typical editorial, requirements and criteria, and so on, and authors that are interested in submitting proposals to the G20. Then pitch, they submit their abstracts, they get evaluated and so on. Now, this year we decided, T20 South Africa decided that, look, you don't just want to have people, labor, extensively putting together, some, hard work, to provide solutions, to provide innovation, that no one is going to digest or read, right? So we had to look at, how best, to, make sure that, what we do receive actually lands, at the table of, policymakers, i.e., the G20, what we call this interface, right? Now, we decided, we're only going to publish about up to 100, policy briefs. I think in the end we went a little over, maybe by 4 or something like that. And we also decided that we're going to make this a little short, so that they are, they are readable, and so on and so forth. Now, that's just the one, process, the one part, of the T20. You also have to organize actual face-to-face, engagements. Typically, your T20, calendar year would feature a minimum of 2. Such conferences, such engagements. It would be an inception conference. It can be either online or in person, depending on your budget. India did it a little bit differently. India's conferences were literally in January, literally at the beginning of the year. They had a budget. Brazil, on the other hand, had an online inception conference, a midterm conference in June, and a summit in November, as well. It was. And South Africa followed, a similar pattern. We had, pretty much the same. So that's essentially how it works. So at the end, usually just about the middle of the year, introduced by Brazil, this concept, you put together a communique or a set of recommendations to the T20 Sherpa. That's right at the prime time when the leaders' declaration begins taking shape.
Thank you. I was going to do a Ronald Lamola and interrupt the president during the G20 address to say, no, you can't tell them that you now have to discuss the adopted consensus. It was supposed to be a surprise. But anyway, but I think that's really great because what Mika's done is that he set a sketch of what a process is. It's not something that just springs up. And the reason Mika's tired is because he's been doing a lot of the heavy lifting in the Secretariat as well as in the T20 engagement with other engagement groups. But what I want to do is now turn to Dr. Duma and to Arena because you both were in different thematic areas in the T20. Dr. Duma, you were with African development, SDGs, and I think there was one other, financing. And Arena, you were with trade and investment. For both of you, one of the things that I found interesting was how did the African voice come through in the discussions you had around these thematic areas that Mika outlined, but the policy briefs? Because the policy briefs, from what we could gather at the G20 summit when the declaration was eventually announced as adopted, is that there was a sense that the language was too conciliatory. Two, that it didn't do enough to be positioning the African voice in terms of pushing for debt relief and talking about debt in a conciliatory way. Because I think what's important to bear in mind is that these working groups in the T20 don't just comprise of South African think tank representatives. They are a collective from the 20 countries from the group of 20 plus other members.
Thank you very much, Sanusha, and good afternoon to everyone. And thank you very much for sticking around. You do understand it's a bit very late now, and people may wanna go and have some rest at home. And I also do understand the exhaustion, Mika. We just finalized the G20 Social Summit just last week on Thursday, and it's been a really long 3-4 weeks in consolidating the South African G20 agenda. Now, to move on just to the point that you finalized on, Sanusha, in terms of how the South African G20 process was not just the concentration of think tanks from South Africa, but rather across the globe, of course, with that some level of emphasis on the global south and the African continent. In total, we have 120 participants across all the 5 task forces, which Mika did not have a chance to go through all of them, but Arena and I will do that as I focus slightly on the one that was on financing for sustainable development, which was a topic that was touched on in one of the recent sessions we've had here, and then we have financing for sustainable development. And both in terms of my involvement within some aspect of the South African G20 and the engagement group, that being the T20, there has been that common thread of trying to emphasize the African agency in this space, in particular, of course, the global southern one. Again, we're not operating in a vacuum. We were the 4th of the last 3 consecutive global southern G20 presidencies, starting with Indonesia in 22, India 23, Brazil last year, and then ourselves now in 2024. And from the side of the T20, it was a very deliberate consolidation and sustainment of this global southern agenda in the matters of the G20, and that was one of the main mottos that we adopted. And I'm doing this to highlight that one main issue in terms of driving the policy proposals in the context of policy briefs, as we were receiving inputs from, again, different think tanks from across the world and the African continent. One common thread is the reintegration of the African continent into the global economy. Again, I'm making this line of argument or observation from all the submissions that were made, given how our discussion here is framed today. That is Africa and the world. How do we relate to the outside world? There is a very deep desire and appetite for an reintegration of the African continent, be it partnerships and economically. We do know that we have a very, what's in economic terms, the nature of the relationship being very extractive in nature, and of course some political relationships in many extent being very paternalistic, being in relationship with some countries that in some ways there is some form of favoritism that you're getting as a result of being in a relationship with them. So the main point being the structural change. It's been very fundamental that the nature of the economies in Africa, if they are going to be sustainable going into the future, there has to be some fundamental structural changes. And that has brought back one of the concepts that have been observed as mainly offensive not so long ago, the issue of the industrial policy. Now we speak of the sustainable industrial policy. It made its way to the G20 declaration. 10 years ago, that would have been next to impossible to find a concept like that in such a high-level declaration, especially given the context of the multilateral forum for international economic cooperation. That is to say, the structure of the African economies, again, we do understand that the critical mineral conversation is very recent, and I did understand the conversation in the critical minerals are very much critical. That is hinged upon the just energy transition. But throughout history, hundreds of years during the colonial era, it's just been the plundering of the resources from the African continent, which has not in any way benefited the peoples of Africa. There's been a lot of policy briefs and proposals that seeks to contribute to revising that international division of labor, that it is not unsustainable. And then if you speak about South Africa's, for example, theme, solidarity, equality, and sustainability, I like to split sustainability into two parts. You speak about solidarity to the extent that you are meeting the needs of today without compromising the ability to meet those needs in the future. But at the same time, sustainability means that you have an economic model that is not tied to the collapse, for example, of the prices or the demand for your raw materials. It means that you are sustainable. We speak about China, for example, in the early 2000s, when there was this very huge demand for the African commodities. And a lot of economies in the African continent grew as a result of that, alongside India at the time. But then when that demand dropped, and then you saw the economies collapsing. So how do you build the economies that can withstand that kind of pressure or uncertainty in the global economic cycles? And then we also speak about the issues that relate to the kinds of investments that come to the African continent. Again, they've been very much directed towards the extractive sector, the foreign direct investment, and then those commodities live exactly as they are in nature. And the idea has been that diversify these forms of investment to the manufacturing sector and other economic sectors that could enable these countries to create employment and uplift the standards of living of their peoples. So that has been mainly the common thread, Sanush, I can say in a way, that the desire to reintegrate the African continent fell into the International Division of Labor, where they're looking at the SDGs, which were very much far in terms of behind in terms of implementation. You look at the global financing gap for the SDGs, which is to the tune of trillions of US dollars, and quite a substantial of that is coming from the African continent. So speaking about the task force 3, that was financing for development, and now we are looking at matters of, given that the official development assistance is declining, the traditional offers of this kind of assistance are retreating from the role now. How do you then now tap into the coffers of, like, for instance, the illicit financial flows? So to the tune of, I do believe that the Leaders' Declaration is speaking about 88 billion US dollars. This is the G20 Leaders' Declaration that cites this figure, that the African continent is losing to the illicit financial flows. So it's been, the African continent has been very center to this, not just within the G20, but also the South African G20 president in its entirety. And Mika spoke about just 2 more minutes. Spoke about the, for instance, sorry, I'm very close to the T20 regular engagements with the think tanks being at least twice a year. And we took a more of an unorthodox approach this year. We had what we call the Africa high-level dialogue, because we wanted to send these kinds of conversation. With all of this work that has gone into this process, with this deliberate focus on the African continent, I will be honest in saying that I could not have expected that you'll end up with a leader's declaration that mentions Africa over 50 times, which I think it was or 80 times in total, which I think it was quite remarkable given the circumstances within which you're operating. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Duma. I think all of you probably are so tired that your families have divorced you. So I don't want to keep you here any longer. But I mean, to pick up on what Dr. Duma said, Arena, one of the things that I think is incredible, and I'm going to play a little bit of push and pull here. Is it enough to just have the name of Africa mentioned in a declaration 80 times? But is it more than that? What does it mean? I know it's the first time that the African Union is, not first time, I mean, from 2023, it's part of that. But in the trade and investment thematic area, what were the issues that came out that were kind of amplifying Africa in terms of the trade, investment, and the integration into global markets, and also the intra-African trade issues? But what were the contentious issues that perhaps didn't get into the leaders' declaration, but also didn't get into the policy briefs that were commissioned?
So, no pressure. I think I want to stop my way, backwards and just touch on what Duma has said about ODI and then start to integrate everything. And what's funny about how the world is reacting, specifically from DAC, OECD, ODI trends, is that you see this recession or rather trying to engage less on that, but you see a rise of private capital. And then you also see ODI redirected to in-country refugee programs. And ironically, you also start to see it being reinvested domestically in companies that are looking to invest in at-risk areas, specifically in Africa. So I think that is very emblematic to how, the DAC members, the DAC OECD members that are really driving the sense of ODI typically, and driving investment as well, and how they're trying to change the narrative in certain ways. But at the same time, you see, and I saw a phrase in the declaration that said, specifically with reference to trade, that policy must remain flexible. There needs to be policy flexibility, but not for everything and not for everyone. And that brings me to the issue of trade. And something that the declaration was not able to touch on at all was the issue of the destabilization of the WTO system, where everything is really coming to a fore. And what I mean by destabilization is the appellate court, where you can take your dispute to. Unfortunately, those who are destabilizing the court, the US, because they refuse to elect new judges to serve, they say that this is really impeding on our sovereignty and this is really an issue, therefore no one's going to have access to a court where you can now take your dispute settlement to. The T20 Task Force on Trade and Investment did speak about the alternative, which is a plurilateral system. What a plurilateral is that it gives countries the chance to sign on to pursue this parallel to what the court is actually supposed to achieve. Now, this is problematic because in order for you to benefit from this, the other person you have a dispute with also has to be signed up to this. That's problematic. In addition to that, as a developing country, you now have to dedicate more legal services, expert legal services in trade and investment, to this very highly technical area, not in your country, and you have to now start going through additional court process, whereas the WTO appellate court system has this built in. So it's a duplication. And a lot of developing countries, African countries, do not have access to this, right? Now, the declaration does not touch on this. The declaration does not touch on the destabilization of the WTO, but it does start to talk about other things like job security, like job stability, job sustainability, and these are things where the new industries are starting to pivot off of, and these are important areas as well. But at the same time, if you don't have someone to moderate this, this is where you get a lot of the fragmentation, a lot of the frustrations, a lot of the discontentment with what multilateralism is really not representing. And when we come to your question of, is it enough for Africa to be mentioned? Look, it was, and also your initial question of the language, is it too conciliatory? Where was the African voice in these kinds of documents? And you look at the kind of policy briefs that were also mentioned. I can refer to them in a bit. But I think what's very important to mention here is symbolically, yes, it's enough. It's important to remind the world, but it's also very important at this moment where multilateralism has been heavily questioned, right? And you have a moment where we're supposed to be reinforcing, and that's where it's really come through. The reinforcing and that finding a way to kind of keep your foot on the ground in a spinning room. And this is what the G20 represented for me this year, because it symbolized, where the US was a bit of a destabilizing force, to put it diplomatically. And you saw that there's a kind of rally behind multilateralism and a rally behind this kind of common solutions that they're trying to work forward. It's not perfect, but here is the sentiment. And they're doing it during Africa's, during a presidency that is hosted on African soil. Now, what really did not come out to the fore, even though there was reference to the continental free trade area and the leaders making a kind of G20 cooperation, African cooperation agenda on trade and investment, linking to the continental free trade area. What really is missing for me in this G20 is, how does the African Union engage the G20 process? Does it choose to go through like the EU process, where you have the EU Commission president, and this is balanced out by 3 EU members that are also part of the G20, which is your France, your Germany, who else? Italy. And then you have 2 others that are invited. Okay, does the African Union choose to do that? But unfortunately, while this is a potential model, the African Union should have actually said at this point, we have been within the G20 system since India's presidency. We now have a chance to say, this is how we're going to choose to engage. And they still did not do that. And you can see that gap. And you're not sure how that gap is going to continue through to next year's presidency, where you have a very probable return to what the G20 was looking like at its inception. Also, does it now go to a much more tailored G7 agenda, which is what they've been hinting towards? And just as a parting shot, in terms of the trends, where there is a lot of enthusiasm around regionalization and a lot of enthusiasm around what this means for supply chains and value chains, what's really taken out of context is the impact of hyper-regionalization, where you will see a concentration of reproduced products, reproduced industries in various sectors. And unfortunately, Africa has been too slow to keep up with that trend. And so not only is trade being directed towards extractives, as Duma was saying, but like you also have now a conditionality where Africa remains a consumer. So that's just it for me for now.
You want to answer?
Thank you, Sanusha. I think it's important also to mention, that to respond to the question, is it important the number of times Africa is mentioned? you have to ask important for what, in the G20 process. You have to be specific, about what it is that you want to extract, out of the G20 process. I say this because you can have, the most, strongest declarations, and so on. A country does not have to implement, any of it, if, it so chooses. It doesn't, right? There's no obligation on any member of the G20 to implement a declaration. However, it does place, the aspirations of Africa squarely on the agenda, and that is a major, major, major deal, right? Because last year you did not have Africa mentioned as many times as you have this year, the year before that, and certainly in the new year you're not going to have, it will hardly feature, in the discourse, as the Trump administration seems to be, intimating. I would like, to maybe offer something, of, optimism, if you like. So if, for instance, South Africa, or at least the world, the G20 community succeeds in setting up, the panel on inequalities, right? The global panel on inequalities, for instance. Obviously, you have to look at issues of trade, you have to look at issues of GDP, you have to look at issues of development, because you're not going to eradicate inequality without those issues being addressed, especially in areas such as Africa. So of course it's a big deal, that, Africa is mentioned that many times, because there are also these other elements, built into the process as well. Understanding very well, that I think it was actually quite smart, very clever, on South Africa's part, to introduce, some of these elements, because you then keep the conversation going. You get, you continue with the process, of innovating solutions, to deal, with, issues of trade, issues of development, issues of, security even, but you do them because you want to eradicate inequalities, right? You want to reduce inequalities. So I think, it's well worth noting, that there's some value there.
Thank you. I'm going to give you the floor for 2 minutes, right? But I'm also going to ask people to start thinking about questions or comments that you want to raise, and then put your hand up.
Thanks, Sanusha. It's just one main point in relation to the mentioning of Africa on the ultimate leaders' declaration of the G20, and why I think that is very significant, at least at this very moment in time. Of course, we do understand that the G20 is very much members cooperated will. The next president does not necessarily have to make what you declared their priorities. They have a right to put together their own priorities. South Africa chose to consolidate and sustain the previous 3 presidencies at its own will. As we know very well that next year it will really be difficult. Well, at least we know at this point that it's not going to happen, that there will be any forms of continuities in terms of the areas of focus that South Africa put forward. I'm saying this because I think it's very significant that Africa was mentioned this many times. Again, it's not to say, I'm not naive to think that this now automatically means the critical minerals framework that is in the declaration is now all of a sudden going to be implemented in a way. It does very specifically say this, of course, this is a voluntary, expert report that is put in here, and then member states can actualize the way that they do. Because it's not the first time that the African continent finds itself in the space that it is right now. We go back to the late 1970s, during the formations of the Monrovia Declaration, the Lagos Plan of Action, where there was a reach out to these international systems in terms of requesting that some form of, not necessarily assistance, but some interventions with the development models in the African continent. And then what came back at the time was a very dismissive report from one of the main, pillars of the international financial architecture that we are seeking to reform today, and the whole world recognizing that these institutions require some deeper reforms by the World Bank. And then the report was called, is famously known as the BEG report, speaking about the sustainable development in Africa. And the African leaders were saying that 20 years since the first African country got independence, our economies are stuck, we are stagnant. So we are looking for these possible new economic models. And in a way, the World Bank in response, they just said, well, any policy that is against agriculture is not welcome. Just focus on comparative advantage and forget about the rest. Comparative advantage, you have resources, it's the, if it is extractive in nature, that's the essence of what was being communicated. You focus on that, any economic policy that seems to be biased against these sectors will be deemed as problematic. And then, of course, the African countries had no idea what to do and then followed the structural adjustment programs. Many of you may be familiar with that. And I think this is fundamental, this mentioning at this level of international economic cooperation, because it does signal now that shift in terms of thinking. We are seeing industrial policy appearing many, many times in the leaders' declaration of the G20, the premier forum for international economic cooperation. So that is very significant. Again, I'm not naive to think that this now automatically means these are going to be implemented, but I think it is a step towards a very right direction. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Duma. Questions, comments, hands up? I have 5 minutes, so don't make a speech. Be as succinct as possible, and you get your point in 30 seconds.
Quickly, so I like the point you made about the AU's mechanism for taking this forward. But I think there's a bigger point about, as I think one of your colleagues said, I think we are all tired. The G20, it's not everybody that is going to take this up, and they might not take it forward. But it has presented Africa an opportunity to really begin to engage, look inwards. So it's also about what kinds of engagement mechanism is AU going to carry forward? And can South Africa spearhead this? And I think I want to hear something from you about that. And just quickly, the AU priorities doesn't talk about the governance challenge, which seems to be the precondition for everything. What's your thoughts on that?
Thank you. The gentleman in the back, and then Prof.
Thank you very much. My first point has been elaborated by my boss, so I'll drop it. I was going to ask you whether you are thinking of supporting the AU to develop an engagement framework to engage the G20 going forward, because you had indicated that they don't have it. But let me go to a substantive question that I want to put across. I think in the morning there was a point about Africa having a strategic developmental regionalism underpinned by Pan-Africanism. And here, Agenda 2063 will be the key anchor or the blueprint. Did your work look at the Agenda 2063? And are there any lessons that you want to share with us? Thank you.
Thank you. Prof. There.
Thank you. Thank you, and congratulations for those who are involved. Just 2 quick questions. One, what is the lifespan of these task forces, the working groups that were created under the South African presidency? And this is important because next year it will be the US. Are we going to inherit that civil society infrastructure, if I could put it, for the G20 debates? The second question is, what is your evaluation of the AU's contribution to the G20? Because you are sitting in those meetings. So I want just an honest review of what you think the AU's performance was.
Thank you.
I think there's one here, final one.
I can't see the lights.
Okay, right. But throughout today and in this particular session, we've heard that there have been probably well over 1,000 meetings. The most substantive one, probably about 150. There's been an avalanche of documents that have been produced. Now, for a researcher, a policymaker, a scholar who is looking for this information, they might want to go to Google to search them and get them in various places. What are your thoughts about how to consolidate this information for ease of access, or should we just give up and say there have been how many declarations, maybe probably 10, 15, task force reports, inequality reports, final declaration. I'm just trying to wrap my head that if I am, as a professor, supervising a project in any social science field, how do I guide my students in getting to wrap their head around all these documents? Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Perhaps what we could do is we could actually somehow link the questions. So I think what Bob's asking links to what Prof's asking, and of course, you are the insiders, so you're going to give us that perspective. Let's start there.
I think, let me take on the easiest ones. Maybe I'll try to touch a bit on everything. So if we start with, where do you get this information from? Please do go to the T20.org website. If you Google T20, it's likely just to show you cricket, and obviously it's not. That's not it. There you'll see.
I must say that's the Indians that have captured the T20.
Exactly. So that is where you can find a collection of all of the policy briefs that were published for the T20. But the G20 South Africa website has links to the respective task forces, the engagement groups, as well as outcome documents per working group, for example. And to address Prof. Kadiagala's question at the top, what is the lifespan of these task forces? You know, when we inherited the T20 presidency, thanks, Anusha, when we inherited this, the presidency, I remember sitting almost a year ago at IPATC's headquarters, and we were brainstorming what can we take forward and what is relevant for Africa. And so there is a bit of leeway to actually debate how do you leverage on what is available institutionally via memory, but also what can you innovate. And so the task force and the way it's been discussed stops with South Africa's presidency, and we'll see what happens next year. In terms of Africans participating, I found that when we made the call open, the idea with the African Union being a member is that any country who is a member of the African Union can make a submission. And so in terms of the T20 policy brief submissions, we said you have to at least have a Global South author, a Global North author collaborating, and also having this kind of engagement where it's where you reach gender parity at the same time. So, are we moving? Oh, is this the Oscar music? Okay, this is the Oscar music. So I'm not going to touch too much on the African Union governance. I do think that NEPAD and the Continental Free Trade Area guys, they really came to the party and engaged as agencies, but I think maybe we can take that discussion further bilaterally.
Thanks, Arina. Maybe I'll just build on that, the point that you ended with. On the AFCTA, and I'm going to link that to the Agenda 2063 and overall, because again, the Leaders' Declaration speaks about the regional economic integration, as unbelievable as that is. It highlights how important it is for sustainable economic growth and development in the African continent, and it specifically cites the AFCFTA and why that it is very important. So again, in terms of the Agenda 2063, we know, of course, how central the regional economic communities across the continent are to the realization of all the aspirations of the Agenda 2063. And yeah, I do think that the AU, in its second year of full participation. I do think that there was a very big role that the Commission played in terms of front-loading the African agency in the whole discussion. I'll stop there and hand over to Mika. Thanks.
Thank you. Just to mention, some, very important things. One, the G20 was established to respond to a crisis, right? And specifically an economic and financial crisis. And those crises, generally not originating from Africa, also just to mention that as well. Now, the scope of the G20 has expanded, since George Bush, elevated it to summit level in 2008 in November, right? Each country that, assumes presidency of the G20 has every right to essentially decide, according to its themes and priorities, how it will set up, some of these, whether it be, working groups, T20 task forces or engagement groups, and so on. Some of them stay permanently there because, they are all relevant to the G20. So any presidency that comes in wouldn't want, to really, you really don't have space to exclude them because they are all, geared, they're all tailored for the G20. So it would be remiss, of any presidency to ignore. Lastly, by example, I think it's Indonesia that had about 12 task forces, for its T20, for instance. Brazil had 6, right? South Africa decided to have 5, right? So it depends, on your thrust. As I said earlier, what we wanted to do was not to, bombard, the Sherpa track, with all manner of documents and proposals, and so on. We wanted them to have, few high impact, recommendations with implementation proposals, and something that they can actually read. At the midterm conference, what they asked from us, we're going to give them like a 30-page, plus, communique. They said, no, give us 5. So we decided to put our tails, raise our tails, and we gave them 7 pages, right? Instead of the 5. But be that as it may, we were quite spot on, I think, knowing very well that, the content that you want to deliver to the Sherpa track is something that is digestible, and I think you can see traces of, some of these issues, some of these recommendations in the declaration as well, and a host of, other, documents and agreements that the G20 has since adopted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, colleagues. But before I leave, and we weren't given our full hour, so just note that, considering the long hours we spent in declarations. So just to make a point and to address some of the issues that were raised around the utility going forward of the G20, both in terms of structure, but also in terms of content. And one of the things I think we need to also put on the table is that there's a G20 at 20 review. And the G20 at 20 review was decided at the Sherpa's track in Brazil, or at the G20 in Brazil, and South Africa then took it on, and there's a document. There's a document that has just been published called the G20 at 20 review. It was done by 3 institutions, one of them being part of that was the South African Institute of International Affairs, which is the T20, part of the T20 Secretariat. I want to read out their recommendations on G20 agenda and structure. Preserve the G20's role as the premier forum for international economic cooperation. Going back to the point Mika made, how did the G20 establish itself? 97, 98, Asian financial crisis, 2007, 2008, elevates to a heads of state summit because of the global financial crisis. And I'm very, very hesitant to say, are we going into a next crisis, and how will the G20 respond to that? So what are you preserving in terms of this international economic order? The second recommendation is to reinforce the G20's focus on issues that contribute directly to the mandate of supporting strong, sustainable, balanced, and inclusive growth. Again, a key issue that comes out in the declaration, but linked to what South Africa had in terms of the poverty and the inequality framework, but also the issue around the cost of capital, which we didn't speak about, and how does cost of capital inflate borrowing in Africa based on credit rating methodologies. But this is the one I think is fascinating. Streamline the G20 structure by adopting a flexible approach to G20 working groups, allowing presidencies to pause or activate work streams depending on priorities or when global circumstances require collective action. Consolidating or retiring selected working groups and task forces where they mandate or overlap and members agree on pausing G20 coordination. Limit the number of priorities and initiatives per presidency to maximize the G20's effectiveness through efforts on selected number of high priority transformative deliverables. In other words, we don't know what this G20 is going to look like. Each presidency will have its own kind of mandate of what it will pause, what it will stop, and what it will do based on how, for example, 2007, 2008, because of the GFC, the global financial crisis, the G7 decided the whole world needs to be part of this crisis. So if you think about some of the think tank debates that we had at the T20, both midterm and summit, there were questions being raised is, what is a G20 going to look like? Is it between the G7 representatives versus the BRICS in the G20? Or are we seeing what we saw on Saturday and Sunday, where invited guests like Qatar, like Norway, like the UAE, there were a number of commercial side deals that were happening. And they were reconstituting IPSA, and of course MICTA also had a summit on the sidelines. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. I apologize for the pressure, but I feel it myself. Let's give them another round of applause again. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much to all the panelists, and thanks for your input. I'm really keen to trace the documents that came out from the T20 stream as well, as Dr. Wekesa was saying. Colleagues, we've come to the end of day one. We've come to the end of day one, a very, very packed, but also informative day. It is not for me to close the session, but I will ask Dr. Bob Wekesa to come, but I just need to invite you again tomorrow morning to come. We're starting at 8:30, 8:40. Please be here. We're going to have a keynote at about 9:45, and then we have more discussions. I think you all have the program, but please be here to make sure that you make your contributions and are able to keep to time. Now, I'll hand over to my prof. Come forward, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think let's start by appreciating ourselves for surviving day one. I think we are a relatively small group if you look at the population of the continent, 1.5 billion people. But I think we are doing extremely well in discussing issues that touch on this region, but indeed the 7 billion people in the world, tying all this to the G20. So I think we can also give another round of applause for representing Africa and the world. I just want to echo the words of our program director that we should do our best to turn up tomorrow. And I will tell you why. We have some very exciting sessions tomorrow. While we'll continue with climate change, critical minerals, AI, and so forth, We have curated some very interesting panels tomorrow as well. We will transition into communicating African agency. There will be therefore some excitement around journalism, media, AI, digital technologies, and how those link into a megaphone for the continent in terms of structuring our agency. We do have, I think you've heard Professor Gilbert Kadiagala chip in here and there. His panel tomorrow is also going to unpack the African Union. Is it fit for purpose or due for re-engineering? I'm not sure you want to miss a session led by Professor Kadiagala and on a topic of such importance. We are also going to have some very exciting moments because we have a town hall in there. We have an artistic presentation for those of you who have a sense of art. Not art in terms of drawing, but even rising to your feet to, I think I can see a Kenyan colleague here, to shake a leg. You might be very interested in that. So I want to very sincerely, first of all, thank you very much for staying all the way, but also invite you to arrive early, bright, energetic, and ready for the day. I think let's close by giving a round of applause to our program director. And I think we stand adjourned until tomorrow morning. Thank you very much.